So now I can get attention of the room. I have to start by just saying thank you to all of you brave people to come out in the middle of May in the snow to join us today, and I'm very happy that you did. This is kind of a special guest to have because she's renowned in many ways, which I will tell you all about, but she's also like one of my best friends, so it's awesome to have an excuse to bring her out. So we're really happy today to have Martha Fenimore, who's a university professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. Her research has focused on global governance, international organizations, ethics, and social theory. She's written and co-written many, many articles and books, which many of you have read, I know, because I see some of my students in the class. And she serves on a wide variety of prominent editorial boards and a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, clearly an academic of the first order. But she's also an award-winning teacher and mentor. Just this year, she won the Tickner Award to recognize Joanne Tickner's path-breaking role, combining bravery in pursuing high-quality pioneering scholarship that pushes the boundaries of the discipline, along with a deep commitment to service, especially in teaching and mentoring. And I know that Marty also won teaching awards when I was at GW with her. And then as a colleague at GW, she was always somebody that you could count on to go above and beyond pulling her weight for the university community. What people might know less about, I don't think she's ever gotten an award for, is her role in stimulating and informing policy debates in Washington. She's worked for a long time with the Council on Foreign Relations, also with the National Intelligence Council, and others to work on sort of engaging with policymakers and ensuring that they have a more sophisticated understanding surrounding governance on the issues that they worry about. So Marty Fenimore really does it all and is a lovely friend on top of it. She models just the sort of scholarship and engagement that we want to encourage in our field, and particularly in our role as promoting the bridge between academic scholarship and the policy world that the Carnegie Corporation of New York has been so gracious to support us in doing. So it's my honor and great pleasure to be able to present her with our Engaged Scholar Award, and we're going to hear a little bit about norms of cyber governance. So we actually have an award. I'm not going to take it out of its, I'll show you. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Marty. She's going to talk for a few minutes, as we always do, and then I'll ask her some questions, and then we'll open it up to you.
Well, thanks. That is perhaps the most gracious introduction I have ever had, Deb. That was just lovely. I am not half as good as she says, but I will do my best to at least get a conversation going here about something that I am hip deep in and could use guidance and crowdsourcing for ideas about how to tackle this policy problem that I dove into head first. So I've been working lately on cybersecurity issues, and that has actually changed the way I do my academic research in a number of ways, some of which I'll talk about. But one thing it means at the ground level is that I just spend a lot more time in meetings with policy people than academics. Oh, okay, is that okay now? All right, good. And so I want to talk a little bit about my adventures in cyberspace and some of the things I've learned trying to apply my academic knowledge to this very thorny set of policy problems. And I want to talk about it from sort of two perspectives that I hope are relevant for the conversation we could have here. I mean, one is I want to talk about what social science might actually have to say to the people grappling with cybersecurity problems out there in the world. And then conversely, what can we learn as we engage with these problem solvers, these very smart people who are trying to wrestle this problem through to some happier solution? what can we learn from them that will actually spur us to ask smarter questions, do better work? So, to start at the beginning of this, anybody who knows me might be scratching their heads. Deb might be scratching her head and saying, how in the world did Finnemore end up working on cybersecurity? This is not something I've ever done before. I am not an expert, and I should disclaim at the beginning. But like a lot of things, there's a story here. So I've been working on norms and norms of behavior, how their effects in world politics for a very, very longer time than I'd care to admit. I'm the norms lady. Someone once said, oh, you're the norms lady. And I said, I guess I'm the norms lady. But a lot of that time in the academy has been spent trying to persuade people that these things exist, that they are real. Those of you who read realism, a lot of my realist colleagues, including some of my nearest and dearest friends, spent a lot of years being deeply skeptical about whether I was just chasing unicorns here. But norms are mainstream now. If you believe the TRIPS data, there are more self-identified constructivists than anything else out there in our field. But I knew things had really changed when I started getting calls from people in Washington a few years ago, people in think tanks, people in the Pentagon, wanting to know about norms. Way ahead of a lot of my academic colleagues here. And in particular, people working in cybersecurity wanted to know about norms. And the policy problem they saw confronting them was they have this new policy arena, the internet and associated domains of activity, which I'm going to colloquially call cyberspace. And there weren't clear rules of the road for this domain. A world without rules, where people don't have clear expectations about what kinds of behavior is okay and what's not okay, that's a really dangerous world. And for the Pentagon, which was standing up Cyber Command at the time, this is a pressing issue. So for example, really basic stuff is up for grabs. What constitutes a cyber attack? How do you know one when you see one? Is it enough that there's just an unauthorized intrusion into your networks? But that happens all the time. Is that an attack? What if you add exfiltration of data from those networks? Maybe now we're at the level of attack. Or does it have to be malicious manipulation of the data? Maybe that's an attack. Or do you actually have to cause kinetic damage in the world? Like things blow up, people die. Stuxnet, centrifuges break in the physical world. Maybe it's not an attack until you get there. I mean, there's a whole continuum of activity here. What counts as a cyber attack if you are the Pentagon? And where do you draw those lines? And there's a converse of this too, which is what's the legitimate response if I'm the victim of one of these attacks? What can I do that will be understood as okay by everybody else and not escalate things? And the Pentagon is very concerned about these escalatory dynamics. So can I just complain publicly? Well, that's not super satisfying. Can I counterattack? Can I put on sanctions? Can I hack back and disrupt their networks? And the Pentagon worries a lot about these escalatory dynamics in these situations of uncertainty. And if everybody's not on the same page, this can get out of control really fast. So this is not also just Cyber Command's problem, right? This happens in all domains of internet activity. So think about it from an economics and business perspective. What counts as intellectual property theft? Intellectual property laws vary wildly across governments. Espionage is not illegal under international law. I had not realized that until I started working on this issue. There is no international law against espionage. So what are the rules about cyber espionage for commercial advantage? And again, it's the same kind of questions. If I just breach your networks and copy some files, haven't done any damage to you, is that an attack? I mean, there's damage done to the firm. I mean, and then who gets to respond? Who's the appropriate person authorized to respond? Can firms respond themselves? Do we let them hack back? That's opening the door to some chaos. Can only states respond? And sometimes states do. We indicted these 5 Chinese hackers over IP theft in 2014, and there were sanctions against North Korea over the Sony hack. But states often don't respond for a whole variety of reasons. So what recourse do companies have? I mean, there's a whole range of issues here, and the lay of the land, the rules of the road, just not clear. So in the old days, what might you have done? People might have pushed for a treaty to clarify things. Those days are so over. This is and in this policy arena in particular, actors do not want treaties and are really clear on this. And we can talk about the Russians and Chinese. There's a whole other story over there. But treaties are slow, they're clunky, they take forever to negotiate, and even if you can negotiate them, you can't ratify them. They're just not well suited to this fast-moving issue space. And what the actors that were calling me on the phone, what they wanted was a nimble, flexible instrument, and they think norms are it. So the question is, what can Norms Lady here offer to these practitioners who are trying to cultivate new norms of behavior in cyberspace? This was sort of put up or shut up time. It was an interesting challenge. These are really smart people. They know a lot about cybersecurity. They have a lot of really smart ideas about cybersecurity norms or rules that might make digital life better, but they're struggling. How do they spread their preferred solutions? How do they persuade people to accept their norms and rules? And what can social science tell them? What can academic people tell them that might actually be helpful? So what do you do? Well, first of all, I'm an academic. Research. I read a whole lot about cybersecurity. I interviewed a lot of people, and I went to endless meetings about how you might create new cyber norms. In Washington, you can go to a meeting a day, every day of the year, on constructing cyber norms. But I noticed something in these meetings. These very smart people had a very particular understanding of the nature of the problem, right? Their task was to figure out what the norms should say. And they had a lot of opinions about the substance of the norms. They were remarkably unconcerned about how norms actually work in the world, right? So really good on the cybersecurity part of cybersecurity norms, got that figured out. Not so much on the norms part of cybersecurity norms. They hadn't given a lot of thought to what is this thing called a norm and how does it work or create effects in the world. And that, I think, is the entry point where academics can start to say some things. And in my own head, I break this down into at least 3 buckets of challenges for my cyber friends here. If those of you who had to read took Deb's class and had to read some of these works on norms. Norms are collective expectations about proper behavior for actors with a given identity. And embedded in that definition, there are at least 3 kinds of problems. Problem 1 is the one that IR scholars think a lot about. How do you create collective expectations? This is the part of normativity I think our literature and our research has been a lot about, and there's a big literature now about how norm promoters strategize about how to frame their norm and graft it onto other norms, and that's going to enhance salience and compliance and internalization and all this good stuff. But there are at least 2 more big buckets of problems that I think we as academics don't think so much about, that we're getting in the way posing real challenges for my norm entrepreneurs in cyberspace. One is figuring out what proper behavior is. Our literature, and some of these are smart people, and they can do research too, and they would do their Google searches and say, why aren't you telling me how to figure out what the norms ought to be? IR scholars don't think about this. We tend to pick cases where the norm, substantively, what the norm ought to say, pretty obvious. Don't torture, right? Yeah, we're going to argue around the edges about what counts and what, is this waterboarding or is this not waterboarding, but don't violate rights, don't discriminate. A lot of the civil political rights around which the IR literature is organized, the content of the norm is not what we research and think about, it's how do you spread it. And this figuring out in cyberspace, they're still back at the what should the rules be? And it's not at all obvious what the rules should be. One of my hunches is that the multi-stakeholder character of this policy space makes it 2 or 3 degrees harder to figure out what the substance of the norms ought to be. And in cyber, multi-stakeholderism isn't just a byproduct phenomenon, it is an ideology. They're really clear about this. Going back This is baked into the technologist culture from Silicon Valley in the 70s, in the earliest days, and the earliest governing institutions, ICANN, the Internet Society, the technical institutions like the Internet Engineering Task Force. These are all explicitly multi-stakeholder enterprises. So lots of diverse actors have to be at the table for any discussion. It raises the bar of difficulty, I think. But the third piece of this is actors with a given identity. That piece of the definition, that turns out to be tricky. Which actors are supposed to do which actions? Or who do you want the norms to govern is the question. And again, in our literature, by and large, it's mostly states. We aren't thinking as hard about how norms, other kinds of actors interact with the kinds of norms we construct in these kinds of big norm promotion projects. And in a multi-stakeholder world, you cannot dodge that question. It's a big question about how do you develop norms that are going to successfully be internalized by large swaths of civil society, the business community, all kinds of folks. So what can we say? I mean, I wrote the first piece of this I spun off and published in the fall. I could not figure out a way, given the structure of IR theory, to frame an IR theory question about this, and I would love ideas and thoughts on that. I ended up publishing this in the American Journal of International Law. If I go to these meetings, political scientists are nowhere in sight. We do not show up to these meetings. We are not researching this. If you look at IO, APSR, World Politics, I looked briefly at JOGS, the big cyber article that tells you how to think about this, not there. Not that I can find, so I'd like to hear more about that. But international lawyers, they do show up at these meetings, partly because they have clients. Right? They've got to solve a problem for somebody. And so I published this in the American Journal of International Law with a terrific co-author, a guy named Duncan Hollis at Temple Law School, who used to work at the State Department. And we came up with we have a section in this where we talk about, so what are the strategic trade-offs you're making when you decide how to promote a norm to solve this problem? And we have a whole list of them, but just to give you a flavor of this, you know, so a lot of this will sound like a familiar kind of problem, but when you write it as an action item, it's not quite the same, and it made me think. You have to decide what kind of problem, how do you frame the problem you want to solve? For example, cyber military operations can have damaging effects on critical civilian infrastructure. You don't know how the networks are configured at the other end, so you don't really know how your cyber tools are going to cascade through local networks. How do you frame the norm? One way to frame this would be to say militaries ought to be responsible in the way they craft their cyber tools and in the way they launch these attacks and operations. Or you could frame this the other way. You could say civilian infrastructure needs to be adequately protected and resilient. Those are going to be two really different conversations. If you want to persuade military people to change what they do, that's going to be one kind of norm and one kind of normativity and one set of effects. If you make the responsible party civilians, that's going to be a different kind of conversation, different people in the room with different kinds of effects in the world. And you got to decide which one's going to serve your purposes better. You can do both, and in fact, in that situation, they are trying to push both, and the effects do turn out to be different, but they also get in each other's way because you have norms that don't always mesh very well together because you've siloed this into two different norm promotion efforts. Another piece of this where there's trade-offs is the piece that says, who is your norm going to govern? And there's trade-offs. Do I start with a few like-minded actors? Like you could promote norms inside NATO about how we do cyber operations. That's a like-minded group. You might get some real substantive bite and really be able to say something with depth and importance. But then you don't have the Russians or the Chinese in the room, and they might be the people whose behavior you actually care about and worry about. You could go to the UN, get the Russians and Chinese on board, but you get more breadth, more states involved, but the substantive depth you're going to get agreement on, very shallow, right? So the UN, for example, has a group of government experts working in this area. They stood up in 2004, I think. It took until 2004 to 2013, to agree on the following breathtaking thing. international law applies in cyberspace. 9 years, right, for that. So we're talking about a lot of effort, but that actually is huge. If you've got the Chinese on record saying that, this is a huge win, but you got to set your expectations in a different place. So what about, these trade-offs? I mean, watching people navigate these trade-offs has been just fascinating. And I've learned a lot, and there's a lot I just don't understand. I'll be curious to see how a lot of these pieces roll. But I want to return to the other half of this conversation, which is, what do we learn when we're involved with these kinds of norm promotion efforts? The piece that has been most puzzling to me in the immediate term is the efforts they spend on constructing norms, because watching them do this and realizing how little time we spend thinking and writing about how do you decide what the norms are, how do you construct a norm that you can articulate and promote, this has been instructive and made me feel really inadequate. I would like to know more intellectually about how to think about this. Because constructing these cyber norms has been a huge challenge for my cyber buddies who are actually trying to do this on the ground. Our norms literature, when I think back to that old norms life cycle article I wrote 20 years ago with Catherine Sickink, I think it was like the old economist joke about you've got an economist on a desert island with a can of food, and he's hungry, 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 or she's hungry, hungry, hungry. What's she going to do to solve this problem? Assume a can opener, right? We assume a norm, and then once we know what the norm is, we can tell you how it's going to how we're going to do persuasion and socialization, and it's going to tip and cascade and do all that stuff. But we assume a norm, and I want to now go backwards and say, well, where did that come from? Where did the norms actually come from? And one of the pieces of this that's interesting to me in cyberspace is a lot of the norms literature has focused on what I would loosely call norms with a strong moral valence, like human rights norms. This is in the scientific and technical realm. I mean, you can make a moral argument, and people do make moral arguments to promote their norms, but by and large, these are technologists who, I want to say, would almost be insulted to think that normativity was what this is about. That's not what they think they're doing. It's a different kind of normative conversation. So where the norms come from is a little less obvious. And I've started a project now on what I call aspirational politics with a colleague at UMass Boston named Michelle Yurkovich, who works on food politics. And we're comparing cyber with the Sustainable Development Goals, which have the following, and the intellectual move we're making is to say, these groups have goals. They want a safe, secure, stable internet. They want to end poverty, end hunger. If you look at the SDGs, when you put them up on the slide in the classic UN visual on this, they are not norms. People talk about Sdg norms. They are not norms because they don't tell you who should do what. They are goals. They say we're going to end poverty. They don't tell you who's going to do it or how they're going to do it. And developing this who should do what part, how you go from a goal to the who should do what, which is a norm, is what we're trying to unpack. I mean, John Ruggie's done a lot of work on this with the corporate social responsibility work, and he knows his norms. So that's one way in. But again, there's not a good analog to some of the things I'm doing or what Michelle's doing, so we want to think about that more broadly. I'd welcome thoughts from you guys about interesting problems that you might want to talk about cyberspace, about norm development, or anything that interests you. Questions? Thoughts?
Well, great. This was it was interesting to think about this in cyber, and one of the things that has struck me, Marty knows we've been doing a bunch of multi-stakeholder things, and pulling in people from different communities. And in the cyberspace, it strikes me that the problems could be really different if you think about it as an economic problem versus if you think about it as a human rights problem, which there is a lot of cyber, norm creation going on around human rights, or if you think about it as a security problem. And so I just wanted to start by asking you, kind of how does the kind of multidimensional nature of cyber, because it's really going to be like it's everything that we do gets replicated in cyber. And so, these different kinds of norms strike me, different kinds of problems that would lead to a whole different kind of process.
But what you just ended with, I think, is the way in, right? So when Duncan and I were writing this article for the American Journal of International Law, we have a whole discussion about norms as processes, not products. We were trying to nudge our buddies, our friends, to think about the processes, because when you're promoting these norms to promote only an articulated rhetorical sentence, thou shalt not torture or whatever it is, what you really need to do to create the effects is create institutions and architecture that will interpret and reinterpret and apply the normative behaviors that you want to see happen in the world. So we talk about institutionalization for decades now, and Catherine and I talked about it 20 years ago, but I didn't appreciate then how important this is. One of the things that I've been racking my brains about, I've been talking about norm dynamics for a long time. When Catherine and I talked about it, and when most people, I think, in the academic world talk about norm dynamics, they're thinking about movement of a static norm. We've articulated the norm. How does it move around and gain adherence and compliance in the system? That's what's dynamic. That's what's changing. In cyber, for sure, but I would bet in a bunch of your multi-stakeholder issues, the environment and other places, the content of the norm itself, what we think is the right behavior, is going to change at least incrementally as the technology changes, as society changes, as the world changes. And so there has to be a dynamism built into the substance of the norm. Norms work in the world by actors picking them up. They have to apply them in the situation that they're facing at the moment. And H.L.A. Hart, back in the long ago in the international law world, talks about sort of penumbras and of uncertainty around law. You have to do these applications which involve an interpretation because no abstract rule fits a particular case. So every application is an accretion of new expectations about how we do things in this space. And those accretions change the meaning of the norm, our expectations for what is good behavior in these multi-stakeholder spaces. But how we plan for that, how you look over the horizon and think about how this norm is going to take on a life of its own and how it's going to move through the world, how are other actors going to pick it up and apply it in their contexts. Is that going to lead to a place we want to be as promoters of the norm in the first place? Because once it's out in the wild, it will take on a life of its own, and it's in the hands of the people whose behavior it's shaping.
That's really interesting. And that, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about the rather unremarkable progress that the UN made saying that international law applies to cyberspace, it's so funny because I think 5 years ago, I would have just rolled my eyes. But having looked at the sort of governance development in private security, actually deciding that international law applied and going through the process of translating international law into the private security domain was actually huge. And it went from being something that you had no idea what to do to being, okay, we can say this about this relationship, that about that relationship, and this one we actually can't say anything about. So we actually do need to develop something there. And so I wonder, whether as you're looking at it, you see this, unstartling development perhaps leading to some productive exchange about what to do.
Oh, yes, and I didn't mean to diss these folks at all. This was,
I know.
Again, really smart people working really hard, and minds were changed and progress was made in the conversations that rolled over all those GGEs for that long. One of the things as a scholar that interests me, so I'm interested in this from the policy perspective. but I can't stop my little scholarly brain from turning, so it turns. When I watch the US government do this, so it's Chris Painter at the State Department, Michelle Markoff, who works with him, who has to staff these meetings, and they are extremely savvy and self-conscious about the kinds of things they're doing. And it ties into this aspirational politics project that I'm working on. I mean, one of the things, these big picture, it looks like a lowest common denominator kind of agreement, but their logic is that you have to articulate these most basic principles. International law applies in cyberspace or to private security or whatever your issue domain is. And then once you articulate these big principles, then you can start to pull down low-hanging fruit and figure out what else can we agree on. And you've already backed people into a corner, so we can set aside a whole bunch of stuff. No, remember, we agreed already, law applies, so let's look at the law, and now our conversation's in a new place that it wasn't in before. So there's a ratchet effect to this that the actors are very conscious about. But again, you have to be looking over the horizon to think, okay, I'm going to ratchet, and I think it's going to ratchet me this way, but whoa, in that body of law, there's also some other tools that other people might pick up and run with in a direction that maybe I'm not so happy about. How am I willing to open up that box for them? I might have to get this piece, but I'm running risks. How are we going to interpret? There might be future conversations about that thing you identified over to the side. Well, am I ready to have those conversations? Do I think they're going to go my way? This is the process side of this is huge.
Right. Yeah, and that's the part that's the least defined. I mean, multi-stakeholderism is everywhere. I mean, I think it's more baked into the cyber realm because they kind of grew up with it, but it's in every realm. I mean, everywhere you look, there are multi-stakeholder enterprises going on. But like who the stakeholders are and what they do and how you revisit them are really unformed. And so it's like there's a lot of kind of even institutional shaping, I think, to be done about the multi-stakeholderism. But let me ask you something about the sort of academic policy interchange. I mean, one of the things that I see a lot is that policymakers, even though they might be doing kind of innovative things, they often use as language, because they're all educated at Korbel and
they're you
and
guys,
other places.
Right? Yeah, it's you guys. So that they all took advanced class or something like that.
But
right?
they take this language in the academy and they apply it, even though that's not really the best way of describing what they're doing. And I was just curious if you had seen a similar kind of dynamic, and that's one way of sort of thinking about what can we do language-wise and concept-wise to like help these people actually understand more concretely what they're doing in a way that will allow them to make progress.
This is a slightly sideways answer, so let me just see if it circles back to someplace interesting. Right. So one of the things I noticed in this world was the search for is the role of analogical reasoning and the search for what has happened in the world before that I can draw on for lessons as I try to navigate this new space. So they look back to what did I learn in graduate school? Was there anything there? And this is, cyberspace is not one problem. This is a huge array of problems. So one of the striking features about this is the very different conversations that go on in different pieces of the cyber governance universe. So for example, there is a security conversation. They have a language. They all read international security, and they will talk to you about the offense-defense balance, and they will talk to you about escalatory dynamics and all this stuff. Often they have deep academic training in these issues, and they have a particular language. But there are at least 2 or 3 other buckets, right? So there's a private sector conversation among both in the Valley and the big technology firms that are developing the cyber architecture, the networks, and the software. There is a big business conversation. There's Wall Street, right? They have a different set of conversations. They have their own language. And then there's the human rights and privacy activists. Human rights online is huge. This is, and the surveillance side of this, right? And these conversations collide often in the institutional spaces, and it matters how it rolls. So for example, what do you do? One of the things that became clear during the Syrian civil war and earlier, there's a fellow named Ron Diebert who's up at the Monk School in Toronto, runs an outfit called Citizen Lab, which does sort of the forensics on a lot of sort of malware development, and they're particularly interested in protecting human rights. They have a big human rights portfolio. And it became clear that US technology developed by US firms was being used by Assad in Syria to do the bad things that Assad in Syria is doing. And they can trace this back because they have the forensic skills to do it. But when you put these different people in the same room to say, okay, of what is this an instance? Is this a security problem? Do we need the Pentagon here for this? Is this a human rights problem? Well, yes, that too. Is this a business problem? Well, yes, that too, because somebody's making money off, this is a whole industry. So what set of rules of how decisions get made, where we're going to govern that problem matters. In this case, the decision was made, I'm speaking in the passive voice on purpose, to put this in something called the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is an old Cold War institution that was designed to monitor the export of dual-use technologies during the Cold War. Institutions never die, they just find new jobs in the world. And there was a computers provision. There weren't a lot of computers during the Cold War, but a few. And so they put surveillance software and a variety of other related cyber items into this dual-use category. But this means it is being governed now by people who think in the security frame. Human rights people don't have a seat at Wassenaar conversations. That the structure of the institution does not include them. It does include the businesses because these are business interests, but not the human rights guys. So some of it's language, but a lot of it is sort of constructing the nature of the problem.
Right. Although, to the degree that you get different communities speaking to one another, then you might be able to construct the nature of the problem in a more interactive kind of way. The idealist in me.
Well,
says.
no, but universities are a place
yeah.
that sometimes can happen, but less than you think. And so when I go to conversations in Washington, and you can tell it just from the dress code in the room, I can go to conversations in Washington, and there's almost always some uniforms in the room. You go to conversations in the Valley, not a uniform in sight, right? Military is just often not, well, I shouldn't say that. Occasionally at Monterey, they'll show up, but even rarely, right? It's just a different, when I go to New York, the Council on Foreign Relations meetings in New York look really different than the Council on Foreign Relations meetings in Washington, because different people come. Wall Street comes to the New York meetings. Google and Microsoft come to the Washington meetings. So, and they start with different understandings of what do we need to talk about, because they don't agree.
Well, I have tons more questions, but I'm sure you do too. So do we have questions from the audience? Yeah, Heider. Yes, use the microphone. Our videographer tells us in the back. We listen to the people who.
Thank you very much. I'm an economist, but you may be surprised to know that I have used that article by you and Catherine Sikink in my classes. I think it's a very good article, and thank you for your very stimulating talk. I have two questions. One is a kind of theoretical question. The other one is basically a takeoff on what Debbie was asking about the language of policymakers, because I have also worked and continue to work with policymakers in the field of international and development economics mainly. The theoretical question is the following, and it comes out of actually a recent NSF grant proposal I wrote with two people in computer science who are in cybersecurity and an engineer. NSF is very interested in these issues. And what I found is that we all are well-trained in mathematics, so we can actually agree on mathematical model after some discussion. But the part that I think my engineer and cybersecurity computer science colleagues find impenetrable is precisely what you are discussing about norms. And like you, I have actually ended up publishing my stuff in law journals on this. So the question is, how can we move from a discussion usually carried on in game theoretic terms that you have multiple stakeholders, N agents who work under various informational constraints and have strategies that would be different. And I gave a talk in Silicon Valley, and I found exactly what you just described. But they are not the only people, but they know very clearly what they want. But that's not what other people might want. So there is the theoretical problem of finding a language to discuss norms that goes beyond the standard cliches of game theory. And they're important cliches, and it's not easy to solve those problems, so I'm not really downplaying those things. But we need a new language. And second question connected to that is, yeah, I have exactly the same problem with many of the people in policymaking communities in the World Bank, in Asian Development Bank, and United Nations, where I have occasionally been present. I think for academics like me, it's much easier to pick up practical policy language than it seems to for some of them to actually switch from what they think is the academic language and they should be using, which quite often is inaccurate and misleading, to what they normally use. So how do we change this culture?
Let me start with the second one first. I guess I'm not 100% sure it's only language. Well, and I don't want to minimize the importance of language, but the other thing I notice in the policy community, and something they would really like from academics, they don't have time, right? Mm-hmm. These guys have day jobs. They are running as fast as they can to put out the fires on their desk at the moment, and they're looking to people like us. They have, admittedly, rather romanticized ideas about life in the academy, and we sit under trees and think deep thoughts as opposed to going to faculty meetings and all the other stuff we do. We do get paid for taking the long view and thinking big. They don't get paid for that. They get paid often for solving the problem in front of them and presenting disaster tomorrow. While there's a language problem, there's also just a sort of structure of work problem. They don't have time, and one of the things I notice, and this is a common human impulse, in these meetings, what conversations tend to do is collapse inward on the detail. The place they feel their comfort zone is they know all the details and every acronym associated with every little detail of their particular corner of the universe. And to get them to stretch and think big about playing it forward 5 years or playing it forward 6 months, or what would you do in other people's shoes? It's not always something they're given the opportunity to do. It's not something always that they've thought a lot about. So creating environments where those people can actually take their smarts, take a deep breath, and do that in a non-threatening way. I mean, the people whose thinking you most want to affect are often people for whom it is structurally just really hard to let their hair down because they don't dare be caught saying unguarded things, right? No one wants to be the next Larry Summers or whatever it is, right? So I don't know if that's the right example, but you get my drift, right? So I think that's a problem. I mean, there's another part of me which looks at, economists do sometimes show up at these meetings, although less often, but I think there's also a difference between, for example, mapping out the structure of the game, which I agree, you and your colleagues, I'm sure, do extremely well. But a lot of what my interlocutors are doing is trying to figure out, what game am I playing? I don't know what game this is. I don't even know who the players are. Sometimes they know, but the structure of the game is just not obvious to them. I mean, they don't even know. And there's a part of me, too, that thinks this norm construction process, there's a sense in which I feel we as political scientists, at least, ought to have something to say. This is politics at the most garden variety level. These are different people who want different things, right? There's one set of networks, and we all got to live on the same set of networks. These people want to make money. These people want to prevent, assaults on the national security. These people want to protect their privacy. This is conflicting interests in the same space. This is what we do, right? But it's been hard to turn that into action items. Again, you can try to take discrete pieces of it and look over the horizon, think analogically about, well, it worked here, it worked there, it didn't work there. But it's not there's a lot of art and less science than a social scientists might like to think that there is in this biz.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Sorry, I'm at the microphone.
yeah. Okay. That's all right.
You can join me.
Go
don't know if
line
it's
up
on.
behind Rachel,
Come on
Evan.
up. We should form a line. So I'm
That's a
Rachel
norm.
Epstein. I'm on faculty. I just want to say your work really opened up the field of IR for me and many other people decades ago, so thank you so much, and it's a delight to have you here. I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the relationship between norm construction, as you're talking about it today in cybersecurity, and enforcement or kind of more normal structures of authority. A lot of my early work was on norm diffusion in the post-communist world. And I think what was striking there is the norms that I was looking at didn't necessarily have a moral valence, as you talked about it. But getting enforcement was tied very much to making the targets of norm diffusion feel embarrassed about not complying. And so that also makes me think in this very early stage of norm construction in cybersecurity, that there should be ways of creating social pressure around complying. And I'm just wondering, in your conversations with policymakers, do they start with the idea of enforcement, or do they start somewhere else in this conversation about norm construction?
That's a great question, and they're very much thinking about this. So there's a bunch of big meetings in March at MIT, and this was one of the refrains is, we've been doing these GGEs for a decade now. It's time to move off this and start thinking, people are going blah, blah, yes, yes, talk, talk. We want to talk about enforcement now. So there's interest in this. I see different dynamics in different of the conversations that I see across the cyberspace domain. In the business community, I think embarrassment and reputational costs matter hugely, and that can be a very powerful tool. In the interstate domain, it's not clear because there are conflicting ideologies about what kind of space this is and what kind of problem this is, and a lot of them revolve around state sovereignty. But one of the things historically to watch about this that's interesting about this space is it's a space that develops out of these technologists in the 70s, and states did not take much of an interest until the 90s. So on the one hand, yeah, you get early mover advantage for these technologists and their cute little multi-stakeholder models. But when the big gorillas start moving in, the states, and especially in the Clinton administration when they opened this up to commerce, there's a recognition in the early 90s, and certainly by the end of the 90s, in 98 when the web comes online, states all recognize the potential of this, some of them faster than others. And they are approaching this, and so they're muscling their way into this space, and they're able to do it because they're states and they're big and powerful. But there is a very clear articulation by the Russians and the Chinese in different ways, with big parts of the developing world backing them up, that says the internet now is a crucial resource of power, far too much power to leave in the hands of a bunch of unaccountable technocrats who we frankly suspect are mostly tools of American power, because ICANN and these other things are all staffed by Americans and headquartered in Santa Monica and all that stuff. And they think, why don't we move this to the International Telecommunications Union? If this is really a global issue, every state ought to have a seat at the table. Sovereigns are equal. We should each have a voice. That is the just and legitimate mode of norm creation that should be at work here. This terrifies the West, right? This is an appalling idea. And one of their argument, there's a whole multi-stakeholder normativity argument that they'll make, but a lot of it actually comes down to engineering. They say, look, it works. You give it to the ITU, they'll break it. They'll kill it. And they can say, look what the Chinese are doing already. They're balkanizing the internet with great deal of energy, and very successfully. This is what the Great Firewall is doing. And other states are going to China and saying, we want that. We want some of that. How do we? Pakistan would love to do this, right? And I think having watched this conversation rolls, I don't think China can export the Great Firewall without exporting the wetware, which is the Chinese Communist Party. I think you need the people to really make this work, but that's an off the cuff. I'm not sure that that's right, but I think that's true. But these are dueling ideologies in a way that might look familiar if this is your background. But they are deeply rooted in articulated notions of state sovereignty and state prerogatives. And they're deeply rooted in concerns about authority and legitimacy in this multi-stakeholder model that Silicon Valley is so in love with. To who exactly are you accountable? Who put you in charge? What was the legitimate process that got you there? And they'll articulate reasons why people sit on the ICANN board or staff the certs and the IETF and all of the other pieces that make the networks run. And it's a conversation about expertise. But expertise is all about inequality, right? It's a statement that I know more than you, so I get the seat and you don't. Well, guess what? Where the experts live, they live in the global north and not in the global south. And there are efforts to try to bring in the global south, and this is complicated in ways that may look familiar. But it's and this is not a settled question yet, right? There will continue to be pushes at the UN to move internet governance out of these multi-stakeholder institutions and into the UN. And there was at the Dubai Wicket meetings in December of 2012, when they thought they were just approving random updates of international telecommunications regulations, this bloc inserted provisions that said, nope, this is all moving to the ITU, and it passed by a resounding margin. And it's developing countries. If you think about this, you're in the developing world, and you say, the internet is powerful, I know that. It could disrupt my society, it could unseat my government, it governs a lot of the commerce that does or doesn't come to my country. Do I want a say in that? Which do I want, these little multi-stakeholder things that the United States designed, or do I want this to happen at the UN where I get a seat? This is a no-brainer. This is hugely attractive. That's a very attractive position, and this is not settled by any means. So it's an interesting conversation, where does authority lie? What legitimates the authority to rule and rule make in this space? It's an interesting problem.
Thanks very much. And so my question is very much related to Rachel's about enforcement. And it seems to me that building norms relatively on the easier part of this whole project, but enforcing them is difficult. And not because of how you enforce them or who enforces them, but how do you get to the point of enforcement? And that requires you first to identify who's doing it, which is still very difficult in today's age. So even forensics are imperfect, anonymity is pervasive in cyberspace. And then you also have non-state actors who conduct many attacks who really aren't following norms in other domains as well. So how do we get to enforcement basically, and is that part of the discussion?
There's been, so I take this question to have at its root the always lurking attribution problem, which is a big bugaboo in this space. Because one of the things about this space is you don't even know, you can see spectacular violations of a whole lot of norms. And so think about the WannaCry ransomware episode that we're running through right now. How do you know who's responsible? Who violated the norm has been one. So there's been a bunch of kind of standard concerns about norm development and enforcement. One is attribution. The other is related is secrecy. With the old New Yorker cartoon, one thing about the internet, no one knows you're a dog on the internet. You got the dog typing. They don't know who you are, right? So what do you do about this? The forensics have gotten better, right? So attribution has gotten easier. And actors are more self-confident, particularly state actors are more self-confident now in calling people out. That said, you still need to, but there's still a lot of fuzzy wiggle room. So for example, there's a big discussion about, and a really good book coming out, about proxies. So think about if anybody followed both the Ukraine war or the attacks in 2008 around Estonia, 2007, I guess. A lot of the Russian activity has been, the Russian state says, wasn't us. And the Chinese will also say this, wasn't us. But there are these kind of gray areas, actors who might be PLA members, but this is some of the hacking that U.S. issued indictments for, who are, but working under some kind of authority to the Chinese state. The Russians have a whole panoply of these. But then there are also people who are really free agents. They're patriotic hackers and, might not actually be getting anything from the Russian state. No directions, no money, but they just kind of don't like the West and they like hacking. And there's a whole range of actors. So the enforcement problem changes. It takes on different characters. You got to decide what kind of violations do you think you could actually do something about. One of the things Michelle Markoff at the State Department is fond of saying is that norms are for the good guys. Nobody expects the bad guys to pay attention to norms. Bad guys just don't. That's why they're bad. They don't. Criminals are not the people you're making the norms for. You're making the norms for people who want to do the right thing. And so in that sense, you got to decide who you want to concentrate with your enforcement on. Once the good guys all agree on what the right thing is, you collectively might even be able to coordinate your action and go after some of the people you can now all agree are the bad guys. That would be a happier place. But trying to articulate what the contours of enforcement are and against whom do we want to enforce. This proxies discussion, there's a guy named Tim Maurer who's now at Carnegie who's got a book coming out on proxies that's fascinating. But states will consciously construct ambiguity around their relationship to different people working in this space because they want to fog. I bet this happens in private security too, right? They want to fog accountability and therefore stymie enforcement efforts in this. Bad actors are strategic too. Everybody's strategic.
And they almost never want to be called bad actors.
Oh, no.
Which gives you some power. Anyway, go ahead.
Hi, so my question follows with Dr. Erskine's and Evan's question. So can I just not use the microphone?
I can hear, but I don't know if they can.
Yeah, I think it's for the tape.
I think it's for the
Okay, so for the attribution problem and this commitment to multi-stakeholder of other actors and the state's response to it, I think what we are seeing here is correct me if I'm wrong, so when the state's formation period, especially in the Western Europe, we have seen that states constantly ganging up on non-state actors, both in their own territories who are using violence outside the territories. So if anything, we can expect one of the most underlying norms of the international relations is that states don't like non-state actors using force and challenging their authority. Are we going to see the same thing in the cyberspace? So states ganging up on non-state actors and undermining their own capacity to basically like what they did with physical force and eliminating all sorts of independent force in cyberspace as well. So you mentioned this, that states want their own piece now, even though every state wants to use non-state actors, but if anything states dislike more than each other is that non-state actors. Do we see the same dynamics happening in the cyberspace as well?
So question one would be, who counts as a non-state actor? States in the West very much want a lively business space. The startup culture has been an economic godsend, certainly to the United States, but also to big parts of Europe and elsewhere, right? That this has been an engine of economic growth, that this is a goose laying golden eggs that has been fabulous for states, certainly big, powerful states. But arguably also for other states. And what the global south, global north conversation around this is interesting. But so are they non-state actors? I mean, often the guys in the garage might be your next great startup IPO that's going to make billions of dollars and pay taxes and revenue and give you an economic edge over the other guys. So that's a more complicated conversation. They want to harness the economic power outside the state in the private, well, in the civil society as well as the private sector, because it's a source of wealth. If you're talking about people who are not actually creating anything, they're not producing anything. If you're just talking about destructive forces, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so
Because that's a rather narrow slice of the non-state actors in the world.
yes, mainly.
So we're talking about criminals, pretty much.
yeah, if we
Yeah.
want to see them that way, yeah.
Well, no, but I mean, I guess it's kind of an analytic question, right? Who counts as a criminal? Or my criminal might be your patriotic hacker.
Exactly, but
Right,
at some
so-
point, states have decided they were all criminals when it came to mercenaries and pirates.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing, well, so one of the conversation, well, I remember meeting going on a hike with a bunch of friends from Mexico City. We were at Drake's Bay at Point Reyes in California, and they said, Drake's Bay, why do they call it that? And said, oh, after Francis Drake, the great explorer. And they said, oh, you mean Sir Francis Drake, the pirate? And I mean, if you grew up in the Spanish-speaking world, this is like, he's a pirate. He's not. We think he's an explorer, but that's only because we're Anglos, right? If you were on the other side of this, he's a pirate. But I think the same problem would exist in a lot of these, and there are discussions about sort of cyber letters of marque, because these relationships with states and what we could call non-state, quasi-state, pseudo-state, pick an adjective, actors, that gray world of actordom, that's a complicated space, and states are super opportunistic about how they want to use it and navigate it, and that's very much up for grabs. I think we're still at that point where big, powerful states want to be able to name and shame and categorize much more easily well, actually, I shouldn't say that. NSA and the way it uses contractors has some other interesting features. I mean, what's good for the goose and the gander, I don't know, might not be good for you and me. But there are parallels. I think there are some differences. Well, let me think more about what the level, there could be a great dissertation in this. So,
Yeah, I already picked my
okay.
She says to the PhD student.
I do. There are a lot of great dissertations
Yes.
in this.
Hello. How do you measure progress or success in this field? How do you know when a norm has been constructed to a degree that you're satisfied?
Oh, me personally? I don't have a stake in this.
Well, I guess it
I
could
mean-
be from the community's perspective or even your position as an engaged scholar as well.
Well, so I would say this, that I think my interlocutors at these meetings would say, when we can finally stop talking about it, that would be progress, right? Like one of the things that frustrates them is like, we got to settle some things, so the next meeting is not about what the last meeting was about. And there's a funny set of conversations where heads of the GGE have talked about 2015 or 14 was the year of the endless meeting. I mean, it just went on forever and ever and ever. So being able to feel like, okay, we can cross that one off our list. We can now move on. Like international law applies in cyberspace. I mean, and people are still arguing around the edges, but I think they have some sense, okay, we can move on now. But it's been really slow. It's also the case, though, that they have a very deep sense that questions are going to get settled on the ground without them if they don't do something, right? The technology shapes behavior. Once the technology appears, people interact with it. Those interactions shape expectations about how do you use this technology, what's okay. And so in informal ways, in this space, norms are already getting set, whether the states want to talk about it or not. They can then try to intervene and change it. But the technology is creating the norms as it invites people to use it and interact with it. And just trying to keep up is a major challenge for slow-moving state bureaucracies. I mean, we complain about our ossified bureaucracy, but they can get like way more ossified and have much less capability. I mean, we have a much more capable bureaucracy than most governments. And you know, they would be the first to tell you they're running hard to stay in place. So, but you know, progress is not having to talk this meeting about what we talked about last meeting. And it's been hard because you end up going back to revisit old questions because the technology opens up things that we thought were settled, but whoops, now we have a new widget that does something else. And now suddenly that thing we thought was settled, not so settled anymore. On the other hand, they'll stay, it's a, you know, think of it as job creation, right? They have security, you know, job security, right? They'll still be needed. Cybersecurity, booming field. So.
Yeah, one of the things that you've seen in the private security field is there was a lot of governance that came around private security, like armed guard, you know, a very concrete set of actions. And these companies do many other things. And so one of the things that people hoped was that getting this established, then you could move on to look at, you know, what should you do about private military training? But instead, what's happened is that private security's moved onto oceans. So now there's like a maritime committee to sort of figure out what it matters, but then it's also moved into cyber. And so, you know, I would guess that will be the next committee, but it's really interesting the degree to which I think we think about success in a really concrete way, and it's often pretty nebulous in the minds of these actors, which is kind of interesting if you think about it from a what can we academics learn, is that, you know, it is articulating modes of success that are a little less, you know it when it's all written down in a treaty and tied up in a little box.
It's also the case that oftentimes success is a non-event, right? Success is, I didn't get hacked this year. I was not on my company was not on the front page of the New York Times. But then how do you know, non-events are kind of a complicated metric for success. You know, how do you persuade people at the shareholders meeting or wherever else that it's worth investing? You know, this often they can deter attacks, and there are forensics that will allow them to say, oh, see, we had these intrusions, but we were able to fend these guys off. So it's not complete non-events, but there is that dynamic, especially at the interstate level, because you can't always disclose to publics all of the near misses. This is like nuclear politics and a lot of other things, right? That you don't always want to have big public conversations about some of these things because public anxiety isn't always helpful, maybe helpful to who? I don't know.
All right, do we have one more question? Oh, good. Please.
Hello, my question is specifically about looking at Russian and Chinese military doctrine. It's pretty apparent that they have stated explicitly that they look at cyberspace as a domain that is neither fully at war nor fully at peace. Now, to me, that seems like they've set a normative standard right there. And pitching that against our Western ideal of, well, we really like Google and Facebook and all those great, you know, money-making machines, haven't they sort of already won because they're always willing to be like, yeah, even if we're sort of at peace, we are able to engage in a way that is beneficial to us?
And this is a great example of what's the nature of the problem and of what is this an instance. So this not at war, not at peace stance has, sort of affected, there's something called the Tallinn Manual, and now there's Tallinn 2.0 that Mike Schmidt sort of headquartered. And their task was, how do you apply the laws of war in this space? And one of the arguments that got made was, what's war, what's peace in these situations? And states don't all agree. And if you don't agree on that, are the laws of war in play at all? Becomes a huge set of conversations around this. There are also other fundamental issues around which the Russians and Chinese just have a different understanding of the nature of the problem. So historically, freedom of information, free flows of information is a cornerstone of Silicon Valley and this whole enterprise. That's the reason the networks exist. That's the reason they got built out, because they were built out by academics like us. What could possibly be wrong with maximum transparency and maximum flow of information? Doesn't everybody love that? No, not when you invite states to the party, and certainly not when you invite non-democratic states to the party. And actually our democratic states, they're not always so good about this either. But the term of art, going back to the language question, the term of art in the Russian and Chinese community is information security, right? So they want to be able to control information. Rather than cybersecurity, they often talk about information security, which in some ways turns the Silicon Valley concept on its head, right? That Silicon Valley conversation is often about the security of the networks. They want security control over the information. And that's almost 180 degrees from the normative underpinnings that the sort of original multi-stakeholder model would take on this. So how do you then have conversations across those different worldviews and those different understandings of the issues? How do you get to any kind of understanding about what are we going to enforce? How do you talk to people coming from that place and say, no, your guys were really out of line, we're going to indict your PLA hackers? How do you have a productive conversation in any kind of meeting of minds? There is progress on this, and it's interesting. So there was, well, I think it's progress, we'll find out. So there was a meeting in 2014-15, 2015, Obama and Xi had a meeting about cyber espionage, and this was just the two of them. This is the breadth-depth trade-off. They decided, okay, we too are gonna come to some agreement about what counts as cyber espionage. My buddies who study this say that cyber espionage from the Chinese side dropped markedly after that. The Chinese seem to be, complying with it, seems to be having some effect. And it has but then it may also, if you're lucky, we'll see how this goes, there's a cascade effect, right? So once the two biggest powers agree, the Germans, the UK, and then later the G20 all get on board with the contours of this agreement. So there is, again, a dynamic aspect to the way these norms work. Now, how robust this is, I don't know. You can imagine backsliding, but that's not new. People who do human rights norms will tell you all the time there's backsliding all the time. That's kind of normal. There is, the Chinese made hard-boiled decisions that this was hurting them as a business proposition, and it was hurting other kinds of strategic interests. So they said, okay, we can give on this. Or that's my assumption. I'm interpreting backward from the behavior.
Interesting. All right, so I think this has been incredibly successful because I think it's the first time since January 20th that we have not once in an event mentioned the politics of the United States right now. Yeah, so it's great. So please join me in thanking Marty Fenimore for a great presentation without Trump.